Well, thank you so much, Marion. That's too kind in the introduction. You know, one of the things that brought me here was crack and race. That in 2009, as we were working on, as Marion mentioned, with a bunch of other people, on the 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder, I was asked to come here and give a faculty colloquium where I just talked to the faculty. And I came up and talked about what I'm going to talk about today, actually, to the faculty. And on the drive back to the airport, the dean at that time asked me, "Do you ever think about leaving Baylor, where I've been teaching for 10 years?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. What have you got?" And he said, "What do you want?" And I told him that I wanted to have a clemency clinic, that I couldn't do that at Baylor, that I wanted to find a way to go back to those people who had been left behind by the reforms that we'd achieved. And he said, "We can do that." And so went back, talked to the kids about the move. My daughter Lily's here. She probably remembers this, that we suggested, "Hey, we're moving to Minnesota." Unfortunately, we did it on April Fool's Day. And that was really probably bad timing in terms of having them believe us. So one of the things that I found since I've been at St. Thomas, one of the real strengths of this school is innovation. And it's innovation we often don't even recognize ourselves. This is a pretty new school. The people who were here at the founding of the school, many of them are still here. And I really liked that. I liked the fact that you could say, "I want to do this new thing," and people would be like, "Sure." And we did. Now, innovation, creating something new, is also at the start of how we got crack. You know, we know who invented the telephone, who built the first mass production car, but you never think about who invented crack, even though it's had such an effect on our society as a whole, on our criminal legal system. So I don't know who invented crack. So I do know how it came about, though. And that is, in the late 1970s, there was a real competition to develop a new kind of cocaine, a new way to ingest cocaine. And the reason that there was a competition to do this is that one of the misconceptions about drugs generally is that it's not just the type of drug and the amount, but how a drug is taken has a big impact on how it affects the body. For example, people who take opioids, when they start out and they're taking OxyContin in pill form, they don't think, "I'm going to end up injecting," but they do. And part of that is because you get more of a high based on how you ingest the drug. For most drugs, you can eat it or snort it, and that has one effect. You can smoke it, and that's going to provide a higher high that usually is for a shorter period of time. And then you can inject it, which is going to be the highest high, but also relatively short compared to some of the other ways of ingesting the drug. Now, this really matters for a number of reasons. Partly the dangers that go with injecting narcotics. But it was an opportunity to the people in Southern California who thought, okay, there's one way to take cocaine or use cocaine, which is basically to snort it. And there was a ton of people in Southern California who were snorting cocaine in the 1970s. But if we can find a way for it to be smoked or to inhale the smoke, we can sell a lot more cocaine. The other thing is that there was kind of a cocaine glut at that time, especially around 1980. And so it was pretty cheap. And so they were trying to come up with new ways to put it out on the street. Now, there were different models that developed of how to have a smokable form of cocaine. You can't just have a bowl of cocaine and heat it. It melts. It doesn't produce smoke that you can inhale. So it had to be altered in some way. So different methods developed and competed in the marketplace. This is capitalism. Crack is a story of capitalism and a story of race. And we're going to get to that, but we're going to start with the capitalism. That, when they first invented bicycles, there were all these different kinds. The kinds with the giant front wheel and the little back wheel, the kinds with the giant back wheel and the small front wheel. But we eventually ended up with 2 same-size wheels, and that was the standard, and everybody realized that was the best model. Well, when they were coming up with forms of cocaine that you could smoke, there were about 5 different methods that developed, and 2 of them were most prominent. And one was sometimes called the California Clean or Freebase. And what that involved was you'd take a spoon, you put some cocaine in there, you'd mix it in with some ether, and then you'd heat it and you'd inhale what was coming off of it. And that was pretty popular. It was also pretty dangerous because ether is really valuable, and people blew themselves up. In fact, the comedian Richard Pryor, using this method, had a terrible accident in which he was really badly injured. And one of the things about this, though, is that powder cocaine is impure usually. It's cut by the process. And when you put the ether in it, that kind of doesn't dilute it. It kind of removes or affects some of the contaminants that have been put in there. Basically, doing it that way, that freebase way, it wasn't cheaper. It did provide the bigger high. And it was mostly fairly affluent people who could afford to use it. Now, along the way, someone came up with a different method. And that is that instead of using ether, you mix powder cocaine with baking soda and a little bit of water, and you heat it. And it forms a kind of a sheet that breaks into little rocks. And that was crack. Now, in the marketplace, I just gave you the formula for crack. Sue me.
Couldn't get it anywhere else.
It takes it's on the internet. So these 2 methods competed briefly, but crack had huge advantages in the marketplace over the other forms of smokable cocaine, partly because you were cutting it with baking soda. So that made it much cheaper. It was something that was very easy to make. And so there was low barriers to entry. Almost anybody could make crack. And you didn't have to get elements like ether. I don't know where you go to buy ether, but I know where you go to buy baking soda, and so does everybody else. And everybody has a hot plate or a stove or something that you can heat things up on. So what happened then is that crack spread across the country. And again, it was capitalism that propelled it. Now, when I became a federal prosecutor in 1995, one of the things I remember during our training was this myth, and it is a myth, which is that crack spread across the country because there was a Jamaican gang called the Shower Posse, worst gang name ever. But the Shower Posse were explained to be kind of the Johnny Appleseed of crack, who kind of went from one community to another, selling crack and showing people how to make it, and then going to the next one, which is a bizarre business model if you think about it. Like, why would you do that? I mean, in truth, what happened was that someone in a community would figure out how to make crack, and they'd go out and they'd sell it. And people loved crack. And so, you could sell it for $20 a rock. Well, the problem was it was easy to make. And so somebody else would figure that out, and they'd go out on the street and start selling. And soon your price is falling to $10 because of competition. And then it's $5. Well, that guy who was selling for $20, he's like, hey, what happened to my profit? And let's say that he's in New York. And South Bronx was one of the places that this started. Well, he's got some friends in Philadelphia. So he goes to Philadelphia. And there he's selling the rocks for $20. But then the price goes down. And it spreads out further and further and further as people establish beachheads, and because it's so easy to make. And what happened next? Once crack had spread across the country, there was a consciousness of it that built up slowly. That it was perceived to be this exotic new drug, but it was also perceived to be closely tied to the black communities in the United States. Now, that was, at least in part, false. There were a lot of white people who were doing and making crack. But if you watched news accounts, which I've done from that period, you would think that it was something that was exclusively within the black community. There was a show called 48 Hours, and they had an episode called 48 Hours on Crack Street. And you can imagine what Crack Street was. It was an all black community where people were doing crack, and they portrayed it in a way where it just looked like it was the worst place in the world. In fact, when 48 Hours started to fail as a TV show, they went back to the well and had another 48 Hours on Crack Street. And so that kind of sensationalism really drove this perception of crack being tied to black communities. Not that it didn't affect black communities, it did. But it was being portrayed as exclusively a problem of black communities. And when we talk about racism and the effect of racism in the public sphere, that really matters. And this kind of sensationalism went all the way to the presidential level. President George H.W. Bush wanted to get more funding for the DEA. And he did a stunt where he asked the DEA to go and arrest someone selling crack in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. So the DEA goes over there. There's nobody selling crack in Lafayette Park. So they went to an 18-year-old kid who was selling crack somewhere else and said, hey, can you come over and sell that to us in Lafayette Park? Posing as buyers. And the kid's like, well, why? And they're like, well, we just want to meet you there. And so he did. And then the next thing you know, George H.W. Bush is on TV holding up a vial of crack saying this was purchased right across the street from the White House. That's the kind of manipulation of facts that underlay what was perceived to be this pandemic of crack. I mean, think about how pernicious that is. Now, at that era, in the 1980s, which I remember, but most of you don't, in the early 80s, there were two public health crises that were interestingly similar, AIDS and crack. And we treated them eventually in different ways. But at the start, we treated them both the same way. That, once crack was viewed as kind of this shadowy underworld thing, AIDS bubbled up as an unexplained illness that was poorly understood. But in the same way that that crack was tied in the public eye to black communities, AIDS was tied in the public eye to three disenfranchised groups, which was Haitians, intravenous drug users, and gay men. And for both crack and AIDS, the instinct initially was retribution. That what we had to do was smack down those groups that are creating this problem. There were talks about having relocation camps for gay men, where they would have to go and live in basically concentration camps to be kept away from the broader society so that they wouldn't spread AIDS. Now, something happened, though. And that is President Reagan had two officials who worked for him. And one of them was a guy named William Bennett. And William Bennett had no background in law enforcement or narcotics, really. He'd been the Secretary of Education. He later became a talk show host. And William Bennett was put in charge of drug control policy. And of course, he demanded longer sentences. He demanded more police. He talked about the death penalty, all in on retribution. Now, at the same time, Reagan had a Surgeon General. There was a guy named C. Everett Koop. Very weird-looking dude. He had one of those beard, no mustache things going. And Reagan had hired him in large part because he was very pro-life. And Reagan wanted that in his Surgeon General. But C. Everett Koop turned out to be a very strong advocate for treating AIDS as a public health crisis as opposed to a morality crisis. And he took center stage in this and said, this is not something where we need to punish people. This is a disease that we need to cure. There were a lot of people in the Reagan administration who thought C. Everett Koop had gone off, on a tangent and they needed to replace him. But the American public really believed in this doctor in a way that we often need to believe in doctors. So we had this division at that point where these two public health crises went in different directions. And then in 1986, things really took a troubling turn. Now with AIDS, there was eventually a public face for this. And it was a kid named Ryan White, who was a middle schooler from Kokomo, Indiana. And Ryan White he was a hemophiliac. He had to get blood transfusions, and he got blood transfusions and got AIDS through a blood transfusion. And so this white middle school student from Kokomo, Indiana, became the public face of AIDS. Now, at the same time, roughly the same time, in 1986, there arrived what became, unfortunately and unfairly, the face of the public health crisis involving crack. And that was a basketball player named Len Bias. Len Bias was an amazing basketball player. He was all ACC, the last 2 years. He played for the University of Maryland, which is important, and I'll explain that in a sec. So Len Bias is in the draft for the NBA. He gets drafted number 2 overall. And he gets drafted number 2 overall as a power forward by the Boston Celtics. Now, you have to, I guess at this point, really be a historian of the NBA to remember this, but the mid-'80s were a great period for the Boston Celtics. They were in this competition with the Lakers. They had Larry Bird. They had Kevin McHale from the University of Minnesota. They were one of the 2 best teams in the league. And somehow, through trading, they'd gotten the number 2 pick overall, Len Bias. And so Len Bias goes for the draft with his dad, I think. Probably signs the giant check or poses with it. Goes back to the University of Maryland, overdoses and dies. And of course, it was a cocaine overdose. Because he was black, everyone assumed, he overdosed on crack. Well, it turns out he didn't. He was with a bunch of people, white people, who were snorting cocaine. And he probably had some pre-existing condition that made him, medically problematic to snort the cocaine, and he died. And that became the public face of crack. And politically, this led to something that really has taken us decades to address. Because what happened was, remember the Celtics in Boston drafted him. Anybody here from Boston? No? Well, just trust me, they care a lot about sports in Boston. A lot. And they care a lot about the Celtics. And so the Celtics, they don't get to replace their draft choice. They're just out of luck. And people are irate about this. And what do they blame? Crack. And who are they represented by? The Speaker of the House, Democrat Tip O'Neill, and Senator Ted Kennedy. And these 2 very powerful political figures go back to Washington and say, we have to do something about crack. We have to do something about this scourge. And of course, there's a lot of Republicans like Paula Hawkins of Florida who are more than happy to join them in that. And what they came up with in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was the 100-to-1 ratio. That you would receive a 5-year mandatory sentence for possessing 5 grams of crack. A gram is like 1 sweet and low packet. Or for 500 grams of powder cocaine. And the thought was, we're just going to come down hard on crack. We'll create this extreme punishment. It's mandatory. Judges can't get around it. And that's what they did. There's some real problems with that plan. And I want to talk about it a little bit. One is that, remember how you make crack? The recipe I just taught you that anybody can do? Well, what that means is that crack isn't crack until it's in the hands of the least culpable person in the whole chain. Powder cocaine is refined in South America. It's transported into the United States by white people and Hispanic people. It's distributed across the United States primarily by white people and Hispanic people. And then, when it comes into a given city, usually it's going to be distributed there by the same kinds of people. Then it's going to get to a neighborhood and then to the street where someone rocks it up on their stove and then goes out and sells it. And what we were doing here was creating an incentive to go after that last guy. And I was a prosecutor in the 90s, and what this created was an incentive to go after him instead of the people that we're bringing into the country, distributing it throughout the country, doing all these other steps. And who they caught were young black men. And it didn't make a bit of difference. It solved no problem. If you wanted people to not do crack, this was the worst possible plan. It's like trying to close down Walmart by arresting the greeter. It's just not going to work. And one of the blindnesses that led us to this morass is the failure to understand that it's about economics. It's about capitalism. It's about supply and demand. That as long as there's demand, supply is going to meet it. And I have to acknowledge my own role in this. This is important. That I mentioned that in the 90s, I was a federal prosecutor in Detroit. I prosecuted crack cases. I was the person who went into court and said, this is a mandatory sentence, Judge. 5 years for the 5.3 grams of crack this guy had. 5 years on top of that because he had a gun under a couch cushion. So this 18-year-old is going to be in prison until he's 28 because they got rid of parole too. That's what I did. And it was wrong. And the biggest problem with it was that it didn't solve a problem, it created problems. Of the people that I prosecuted for crack, they were all black. Every single one. Agents never brought me a white crack dealer. There were white crack dealers. There were white crack users. And there were a lot of white people who were bringing the cocaine into the country and distributing it and doing everything else that made this possible. And when we took that one crack dealer, that one 18-year-old who had 5.3 grams of crack, and we sent him away to prison for 10 years, do you think someone wasn't getting crack because of that? Someone who really wanted crack, do you think like, oh wow, Steve's gone? No. And so what happened to me is that there were some really great federal defenders in Detroit. Richard Helfrich, Andrew D'Ensimo are two of them. And they used to, even though the sentence was mandatory, the judge didn't have discretion. They'd give what people sometimes called the feudal speech. And they'd come in and they'd say, this isn't making any difference. Look what this is going to do to this kid. Look what this is going to do to my community. And then the judge would turn to me and say, Mr. Osler, and I'd say, Your Honor, it's a mandatory sentence. I'm not asking for anything more than the 10 years. And they take him away. But eventually that got to me, those feudal speeches. I realized they were right. And they were right. And they are right. That we don't change capitalism. We don't change supply and demand by picking up this one very low-level person. Well, let's talk about race, too. Why is it that everybody that was brought to me was black? Well, in part, it's because that's who was the easiest to catch because people tended in urban communities to be out on the street as opposed to inside houses when they were selling. But was it also who they chose to go after? Well, think about what everybody had been seeing for all those years before that. On 48 Hours on Crack Street. Where do you go to get crack dealers? Everybody knew, what neighborhood you go to do that. And so did the investigating agents. And so that's what they did. So instead of doing something to solve the problem, they did what was easy. And then because of the laws, you could bring in this low-level seller and he was treated like a kingpin. Discretion matters. And one of the things that these mandatory laws did is that they allowed a lot of discretion to investigators and to prosecutors. If we accept, and we should, that implicit bias exists in our country, and we don't have to say everybody has implicit bias for purposes of argument. We can say just some proportion does. That means that in those areas of discretion, implicit bias plays a role. And it did, and it has, and it's been incredibly destructive. Anti-racism comes in to say implicit bias matters. We have to look for that. We have to identify it. We have to know where it's coming in. We can't allow that destruction to occur. Now, one of the grand debates about crack has been, was this whole thing racist? And you can argue, certainly, that at the outset, it was. When Len Bias had died and people had been watching 48 Hours on Crack Street, and then they go and they create these incredibly long sentences, did they have black people in mind? Probably. But what they will say is, look, this was race neutral. It didn't say anything about black or white in the laws that we passed. And eventually we made them the same for meth, so hey, everybody suffers. But, and this is important, yeah, that was 1986. What about 1990? What about 1995? What about 2003? By then we knew that the overwhelming majority of people that we were arresting, convicting, incarcerating were black. We knew it wasn't making any difference because, and here's how we know, is that the one metric that we can trust in a supply and demand economy like drugs is the street price of drugs. If interdiction worked, then the supply would have been restricted, the price would have gone up. Price went down. The more we incarcerated, the more the price went down. So we weren't accomplishing anything by doing this. Now, shouldn't we have known by then that it was racist? Well, we kind of did. There was a judge here named Pamela Alexander, and in 1990, she found the disparity between crack and powder in Minnesota law to be unconstitutional. That was brave. In 1995, the United States Sentencing Commission concluded that the crack powder disparity in the guidelines, which tracked the statutory one, 100 to 1, they decided that that was unprincipled. And so they proposed a new guideline that would have it be equalized with powder cocaine. To rationalize it, or by that I mean make it rational. But Congress rejected that. It's the only time Congress has rejected a change in the United States sentencing guidelines. And President Bill Clinton signed the rejection. So we knew, and we kept doing it, and doing it, and doing it. The problem is that there's stuff we could have done. One of the things I don't want to be heard as saying is, hey, crack is no problem. Crack is a problem. Crack can be devastating to families, to communities, to places of business. It did affect Detroit. We just chose to do something about it that was incredibly racially disparate and completely ineffective, and perhaps even harmful to the project of trying to prevent people from doing crack. Now remember, The most we can achieve by seizing drugs, by arresting people, by incarceration, the most we can achieve in a capitalist society, in an economy, is to raise the price of the drug. Probably temporarily, because demand will still be there. Now, is that worth doing? Maybe. I mean, we do know that when prices rise, even with highly addictive substances, people use less of it. We know that from cigarettes. When we taxed it a lot more, fewer people smoked. And nicotine's an extremely addictive substance. If we wanted to do that, if what we wanted to do was to raise the price, which is all we can do, then we would have been much better off ignoring all the people, ignoring the drugs, and just taking the cash flow that went back to source countries. Just forfeiting the money as it was going back to whoever was bringing it into the country. And then let the business fail. We did almost none of that as we incarcerated all these people. I do want to allow some time for questions, and so I'm going to just say a couple things in closing. One is that I want to recognize, and I know I can in this space, that what we did with crack was a moral and spiritual failure of our country. It was a moral and spiritual failure. And how do we avoid that? How do we not do that? And part of it is stop pretending that race blindness addresses problems. That was the core problem that drove this and allowed it to survive for so long. You know, we still don't, we reduced the ratio to 18-1, but it's still not 1-1. And we can't get that through Congress. We've got 64 senators, I think, signed on, but we can't quite get it to 1-1, even though everyone knows that's what it should be. You know, those of you that are law students, which is almost all of you, not you, Chris, but everybody else, you're learning a lot about rule complexity. And when I talk about rule complexity, what I mean is where there's a set of rules that apply to a situation that you analyze, you figure out what the outcome will be. Sometimes we have incredibly complicated rule complexity in law. You know, one of them is the narcotics laws. You know, they can be pretty hard to figure out. In habeas, the way, if you have a wrongful conviction and you challenge it under habeas corpus in the federal system, you run up against the AEDPA, which is a law that creates incredible rule complexity for trying to bring your case, even if you're innocent. Rule complexity is important to understand, but we also have to know that it often masks injustice. And that's part of what happened here, is we created rule complexity, imagined that it must mean something. I mean, think about 100-1. That sounds so scientific. Like, there must have been a bunch of people in lab coats that came up with a report and testified in Congress and said 100-1. No, they just made it up. But people believe a number becomes normative once you create rule complexity. If you ever pick up a fashion magazine, you know, on the cover it says 84 great looks for fall. And if I ask you, hey, how many great looks for fall are there? You're going to say, hey, there's 84. It says so right here. 100-1. It's 100 times worse. Just made up. And it did all that damage. Now, beyond rule complexity, we have a countervailing force in our society that as lawyers you need to embrace, and that is story complexity. The wholeness of someone's story. Now, rule complexity can bar story complexity. Think about that 5-year mandatory minimum that I was talking about for just 5 grams of crack. That mandatory means that none of the rest of the story of that case can be considered. One of the reasons that I love clemency and I love working with some of you all on clemency is because it's all story complexity. That what is known about that person that we're representing up to that moment is the rule complexity. Here's what the guidelines were. Here's the PSI with the calculation. Here's the mandatory minimum that applied. Here's the priors that created the mandatory minimum or enhanced it. And we do a lot of math about that 15 minutes in which the event happened. And in clemency, we get to create story complexity, that richness, that life, that reality of everything else that came before and after. Where that person grew up, what they were doing at the time that this all came about, how they got involved in this. And then after that, what was their life in prison? And after that, what will they do when they come out, which frankly is the most fun part of all to tell. And sometimes we get to live it too, and to see that story complexity come to fulfillment. I have something that I have kept, and I know some of you have seen before. It's one of the first envelopes we got when we started the commutations clinic. It was from a man named Ronald Blunt. And on the front, he put 10 stamps, which is way too many stamps. A stamp costs about what an inmate makes for 1 hour of work. Ronald Blunt worked 10 hours just for the stamps to mail this to me. 10 hours of work in a factory, in a prison, without air conditioning in Louisiana. And he writes to me, and I open it up, and you never know what's going to be inside these envelopes. Sometimes it's like, what are you doing? But he sent me 2 documents. He sent me the transcript of his sentencing and the pre-sentence investigation report in his case, and a cover letter that said, can you help me? I'm doing life in prison. And I thought, oh, well, lifer, he must have done something bad. And then I read the case, and what it said was he was a crack addict. His brother, Corey, was a pretty big-time crack dealer in this little town in Louisiana. But Ronald, he was just an addict. And Corey had him help him sometimes. Like he'd drive him someplace, or if people were looking where to buy crack, he'd say, go to Corey's house. Or he'd give Corey a ride someplace. But he had 2 priors for minor narcotic sales. And that meant that for this third one, he was going to get life without parole. And he did. And it is sentencing, so he sends me the transcript. And he's describing his life of when he was incarcerated, what he was doing to get convicted, incarcerated. And he's saying, I had nothing to do with a conspiracy, Judge. I mean, they said, I took them to this place over here to obtain, and the court says, where they got crack. And he says, they got it from the village where I hang at. I hang at a store begging for nickels and quarters and dimes. I stayed on the front porch of my mama's house, man. I don't sell dope. I didn't even have one change of clothes. I had to wash every day, Judge. How can I be a seller of dope? And the court says, well, the jury heard, and then he continues, even in the pictures, you've got my bed. You've got my bed in front of my mama's house where they got this picture where I slept on the porch because they didn't trust me because I stole boudin for myself, a plate lunch that I took to eat. I take it down the street and sell it for a piece of crack cocaine. And I thought, wow, that can't be the true story. So I picked up the pre-sentence investigation report, and it said the same thing. This man had been sentenced to life. This black man had been sentenced to life when he was living on the front porch of his mom's house, so poor he had to beg for change in the park. And that's who we were paying over $1 million to incarcerate for the rest of his life. I went and visited him in prison. Lily and I drove down to New Orleans, and I went to Beaumont to visit him. And he was a Christian. When I left, I took his hands and we prayed. And then later, I got to call him. And I got to call him and tell him he was going to be free. And I called him up on the phone, and they don't know when they're called down to the warden's office what it's going to be about. So he comes down to the warden's office, and they hand him the phone, and it's me. And I said, God is good. And he said, all the time. And I said, all the time. And he said, God is good. And then he hung up. I guess he knows what that meant. A couple years ago, my youngest son, Luke, and I were down in Houston, where he lives now, and we visited him at home. And he was making a big plate of boudin. And that's about as good as life gets in this vocation. That's what we can do if we have a lot of luck, good people to do it with, the kind of support that we have at this school. That's why it's a good place to be. All right, questions? Skylar.
Okay, I know you're in a position now where you're coming back into it, right? You're in crim law world again.
Well, I've always been in crim law world.
You know what I mean here, right?
Okay, yeah.
Some high off position, we don't see you anymore, it's fine.
Don't call, you don't have.
What I'm trying to say is, you're in a position where this is sort of, I see so many parallels with fentanyl.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, like, I know last year Minnesota passed it to raise it to the level of meth.
Yeah.
It's addiction, it's mental health, it doesn't work.
Mhm.
You now, in the position that you're in, do you see the parallels, are you thinking about it, what's going on, that you can actually talk about with fentanyl too?
Yeah. I mean, there's some things I can't talk about because it's in the work. But I can assure you that what I have been talking to you all about for years is what I talk about there. Solve a problem. And I'll tell you, one of the things that is the principle that I want to have within our division is don't restrict freedom unless it's solving a problem. You should be able to answer that question. What problem are we solving by restricting this person's freedom? And that goes a long way towards addressing some of these things, because when you get these racial disparities, a lot of times it's under this umbrella of retribution. And partly because of the bias against that group in the first place. Those conversations are being had. Kate?
Yeah, so kind of connecting Skylar's question to something you had mentioned before about when you're in a position of power, and it's sometimes, unfortunately, it takes hindsight to recognize what went wrong, or that we were a part of something that went wrong. And you mentioned how it was the federal defenders telling the stories and bringing in the insight that you started deferring to recognize the reality of the situation. So I guess my question would be, now also, with the position that you're in, but just in general, moving forward, how do you, and how will you use the community's knowledge and coworkers' knowledge and insight to guide you in what you're doing based on past experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky in that I have a broad mix of coworkers. Up on the floor where I'm working, I'm really the only manager with experience as a prosecutor. I'm surrounded by people whose background is in defense. So it's not hard to find that perspective. I mean, I'm kind of the new perspective amongst that group sometimes. But yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important. And I mean, really lucky because I'm working for an elected, Mary Moriarty, who takes that very seriously. That one of the things she did was create a division of community outreach that Jennifer White is the head of, who's one of the top managers in the office. Mary seems to be out every night meeting with people. So there's been a real culture change that's already happened with engagement with communities in that office that I think is really positive. So, last question.
Last year, Merrick Garland issued a directive to federal prosecutors to kind of use prosecutorial discretion to sidestep minimum sentences.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, every new attorney general creates charging standards. And not surprisingly, during the Trump era, the charging standard was that you always have to charge the most serious, readily provable crime and enhance with, where it's applicable. And what Garland did was take a step back from that, give more agency to the line prosecutors. And it's important to recognize what that means, is that it allows more room for story complexity, that there's a better understanding of the wholeness of what's going on. One of the dangers is that it's going to create disparities between prosecutors, though, that one prosecutor do something different than the next one, and it's important to track that so that we can have everybody have the same chance. Okay, we're out of time. Thanks so much for coming.